So there are going to be a few takeaways that I want you to walk away with this morning from our gospel reading. But the first is this: Jesus is not afraid to use a timeout on his disciples. I know it seems a little silly and a little immature, but we'll get there and you'll understand why that's point number one. We're going to start with some important notes about the Gospel of Mark and things that you should consider when reading through the Gospel of Mark. The first is this, that Mark is a pointer, he is not a painter. If you were old enough to hear and learn from marriage coaches and pastors in the late 90s and the early 2000s, then you might remember those terms. Pointers, if you don't know, are the people who are very direct and they are to the point. They don't spend a lot of time with the fluff and the extra details about a story. They just make sure you know the facts. Painters, gotta love our painters. The painters are the people who love to add details to the story. They love to paint a picture full of colors and images when telling a story. The more information they can provide to you, the better. And some of you couples are laughing because you've gone through this. Others of you are not laughing because you're nervous to look at the other spouse. I get it. You're usually in a relationship with the opposite of who you are. Right? But Mark is very clearly a pointer, even to the point here's some evidence, right? He talks about the first 30 years of Jesus' life in 8 verses. You could not be more of a pointer than Mark might be. Now, there are some really good theological reasons for why Mark is a pointer when it comes to writing his gospel, but we don't have the time to dig into all of those details. By the way, I'm also a pointer, usually. But grab your Bibles and go with me to Mark chapter 6. Mark chapter 6. And as we like to say, if you have littles worshiping in the pew with you, help them find Mark chapter 6 in their Bibles as well. A lot has happened in this section, up to this section in Mark's gospel. The disciples have been called by Jesus. They have seen him do incredible miracles. Even most recently, at this point in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus raised Jairus' daughter from the dead. Okay, so then they take this short jaunt back to Nazareth, where Jesus spent most of his childhood. And while there, they saw Jesus do incredible miracles. They heard him teach, but then they also witnessed Jesus get rejected by the people in Nazareth. The first time he was rejected, according to the Gospel of Mark, and they're told to leave quite quickly after that. But at the tail end of the seeming defeat in ministry, you could call it, Jesus then sends his disciples out 2 by 2 to go and do the very things that they have witnessed him doing. So he sends them on a short-term mission trip, namely to proclaim the good news, to do healings, and even work some miracles. Now, Mark doesn't share it, because again, Mark's a pointer, not a painter. But according to some of the other gospel accounts, we know that these short-term mission trips were quite successful, and the disciples were very excited about what took place. But then what Mark does speak to next is actually the death of Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist. And Mark actually goes into great detail about why John was beheaded. And when pointers give you information, you should take note of that information. Which leads to our gospel reading this morning, Mark chapter 6, verse 30. The apostles returned to Jesus again from their short-term mission trip, and they told them all that he had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now, many saw them going, and they recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns, and they got there ahead of them. Verse 34, when Jesus went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. See, what's interesting is that Mark doesn't record that Jesus was deeply saddened by the brutal death of his cousin. or that his disciples were also most very likely grieved, many of them who knew John the Baptist. He just shares that the disciples come back from this short-term mission trip and that Jesus sees that they are tired, so he sends them away to the eremos, which translated from the Greek means desolate or quiet or wilderness place. The same place, by the way, in the Greek that Jesus was led into by the Spirit when he's tempted by the devil in the eremos. But it's also the same place that he goes to throughout his ministry when he needs time of solitude and prayer. So again, Jesus is not afraid to use a timeout on his disciples. As I was prepping for this sermon, specifically in the context of this sermon series about turning off the noise, I kept coming back to those couple of verses at the beginning of our gospel reading. Which is interesting because what happens next in Mark's recording is Jesus feeding the 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Jesus does this incredible miracle while he himself is most certainly probably grieving the loss of his cousin. He's tired, and he's also himself needing time in solitude and prayer. And we know that to be true because starting in verse 45, Mark records that Jesus sends the disciples ahead of him across the lake so that Jesus could stay back and spend time alone in prayer. But Mark, again, the pointer and not the painter, makes a clear distinction between what the disciples are able to do when they are tired and hungry and what Jesus is able to do. The disciples had most certainly reached their breaking point. I mean, you can almost imagine the audible sighs and grunts that would have come from the disciples as Jesus tells them to go and rest and they see the crowd start to gather. It probably sounded like your last staff trust building exercise workshop led by HR. You know, the fun group called HR, right? It's full of grunts and sighs and lots of eye rolling and whispers to each other. Or maybe you haven't done a trust building exercise in a while, so maybe it was like the last time that you tried to get your teenager out of bed and get them to church or to school on time or to that family dinner. Yeah, sorry. But see, it wasn't a punishment on the disciples that Jesus sends them away. He was actually trying to show them the same compassion that he had on the crowds. But unlike the crowds, the disciples were not without a shepherd. They had Jesus. And we also are unlike the crowds because we too have a shepherd. Which leads me to the second thing I want you to walk away with today. The first is, again, Jesus is not afraid to use a timeout on his disciples. And the second is this, that you can suffer fatigue, but Jesus does not. I think as modern disciples of Jesus, we too often buy into the non-Jesus way of thinking that if we keep pushing harder, we will make it to the other side. Or that if we hang on just a little bit longer, eventually we will get the time of rest that we have deserved and that we have earned, and therefore we just have to hold on a little bit longer. Or maybe we buy into the deception that someday somebody is going to tell us, it's okay, sit this one out. Imagine with me for a second, if you would, what would have happened that day had the disciples and not Jesus actually addressed the crowds? Maybe they would have taught them, but I'm pretty certain that that would have been a short message and they would have sent them away for their food. And you can make the argument from the text that it was said with good intentions, but that would have also then been a missed opportunity to show the goodness and the mercy and the grace of God and Jesus Christ that day as he fed them. And not only did he feed them, but as Mark records, he did it so abundantly that there were plenty of leftovers left for the disciples to finally feast on, because they were most certainly hangry by this point. And so Mark says that before Jesus started teaching, the disciples hadn't even had enough to eat yet. Yet at the end of this section, there is more than enough to eat. I know that I can tell you I for sure have needed to be put in a Jesus timeout recently. And the reason that we're doing this sermon series at this point of the year is because from pastoral experience, you were probably in need of one too. Maybe you've started to experience some of these symptoms on a consistent basis. You know, just a hypothetical list, right? Irritability. That doesn't describe anybody in the room, don't worry. Hypersensitivity. Restlessness, crushing fatigue, nonstop activity, emotional and spiritual numbness, messed up priorities, lack of self-care, seeking escape through alcohol or drugs or porn or entertainment, forgetting to do your daily devotions in your prayer, feeling like you're isolated and alone and nobody cares. These are just 10 of the behaviors, by the way, that John Mark Comer highlights as sure signs that you are suffering from what he calls hurry sickness. Quick side note, Pastor William is leading a Bible study on the ruthless elimination of hurry, from which these list comes. So I'd encourage you to check it out. I assure you that the answer to hurry sickness is not to try harder. The answer is actually found in the one who does not fatigue, and when he blesses abundantly. Which leads me to our third point. Again, Jesus is not afraid to use a timeout on his disciples. And you can suffer fatigue, but Jesus does not. And the third is that Jesus is our salvation. And of course, I mean in the sense of his death and resurrection, that in the greatest moment of his ministry, Jesus shows himself to be our good shepherd as he takes the weight of our sin and our brokenness and our shame, and he hangs upon the cross. And as he takes his last breath, he proclaims that it is finished, meaning the consequence of our sin, namely death, is overcome, and we now have the hope and the joy of life eternal to strengthen us through every season of experience and shame and sin and brokenness that we might face in this life. Of course, I mean that salvation. But I also mean that he is our strength, and he is our peace and our healing right now, right here today. Again, Mark chapter 6, verse 34. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and Jesus had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. The them there that Jesus has compassion on is the crowd, according to the Greek. But remember, Jesus wasn't ignoring the needs of his disciples. They already had a shepherd in him. In his book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, Comer reminds the reader that the life of discipleship that Jesus calls his disciples into, and that he calls us into as his modern day disciples, is not just a knowledge-based instruction. It is actually an experience. It is a following of a way. And as disciples of Jesus, the way that we are following, we are to follow his way. His way, by the way, included times of rest and solitude. It included times of compassion and mercy. His way included times of celebrating and feasting together. His way included times of giving forgiveness and receiving forgiveness. His way included times of speaking the truth in love, but his way also included times of shaking the dust off of one's feet. I truthfully like to favor some aspects of the following of Jesus' way over others. Namely, like rest is probably not at the top of my list, but I could definitely get behind the feasting one. But interestingly enough, across all four of the Gospels, Jesus went off by himself to pray and to be in solitude somewhere between 10 and 11 times in 3 years, an elongated time of rest and solitude. That's roughly 3 times a year. Not to include the daily ritual and the weekly ritual of prayer and Sabbath that all of the gospel writers allude to Jesus doing throughout his ministry. You see, it's actually in those moments of solitude and rest and quiet that we are reminded that Jesus is our salvation, both our eternal salvation and the healing salve for our fatigued and tired and overwhelmed spirits in the moment. Jesus has never called you or me to be for the people around us what only he can be. He simply calls us to love them as he loves us, to show them that there is a better way in this life, and it's not our way, it is his way. It's a way that does include rest and quiet, a way that includes celebrations and feasts, a way that includes forgiveness and reconciliation, a way that includes speaking the truth in love and accountability, a way that includes surrendering to his will and not to our own. It is a way lived in the way of Jesus Christ, not the way of this world. And when you need it, it's helpful to remember that Jesus is not afraid to use a timeout on his disciples. He will put you in a timeout if he needs to. You can suffer fatigue, but Jesus does not. And Jesus is our salvation. And I hope that you notice that you are not the subject nor the center of any of those takeaways. Jesus is. And as his disciples, the followers of his way, it will do us much good to remember that Jesus is the center of everything in our lives and that he is our source of strength and healing and peace and hope. And it will do us much good to remember that the spiritual practices of prayer and devotion, of worship and confession, of Sabbath, of even feasting and fasting, these are all blessings that drive us to the very center of our world, Jesus Christ. And from that center, we can then seek to live as followers of his way, not our own. To God alone be the glory, now and always. Amen.